Are you taking your retreat global? Well, before you book that plane ticket, there are some legal must-knows that you can't afford to miss. The very first retreat I ever went on, of course, after I said I wanted to go, I got an invoice and a contract. I was pleasantly surprised that there even was a contract because I think it was one of the first retreats that this host had put together. But looking over the contract, for me as an attendee, it was great. So much flexibility. But for her as a retreat host, I was frankly a bit concerned. It's not a contract that I would want one of my clients to sign. But she wasn't my client and she didn't ask for my perspective after I told her, like, I have some thoughts on your contract. So I let it go and moved on. So that being said, first, I want to congratulate you on even thinking about taking a retreat international. No matter how small or big the group that you take with you is when you go international, arranging 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 2 weeks of a retreat to allow people to have this transformation in a beautiful place and making sure that all of their needs are taken care of while they're there is no easy task, right? Let's be super honest about that. And by the way, if you want just a really easy start to this, you can go over to our website and check out our retreat bundle. It's a no fluff set of templates for your attendee contract, some lawyer approved responses for really common problems that happen, as well as a walkthrough video that you're not going to get anywhere else to make sure that you understand the contract that you are sending to your attendees and how to change it if some changes are more appropriate for the type of retreat that you're hosting. But let's get into it talking about the contracts with your vendors. A handshake isn't going to cut it overseas. It's not going to cut it anywhere if we're being totally honest. And the contracts you're signing, if there are contracts, may not be in your language. So when we start talking about making sure that you as a retreat host are protected from any of like the what ifs of the venue backs off last minute, your chef, if you're providing one, is unclear as to who's paying for the cost of the food, if it's you or if it's included in their price. Emails and contracts back and forth may not have the same enforceability as they could in the US, and even if they do, you don't have time to go to court. You need to get whatever the issue is resolved quickly before your retreat comes up. When we're talking about what kind of contracts to be looking for with your vendors, it's really important to know that the vast majority of the countries in the world operate on a totally different legal system than the US. Theirs is based off the French, the Americans is based off of the British. And part of the reason American contracts are so long is because we don't depend on the civil code to fill in the gaps for us. Overseas, that is the case, so you may get really short contracts and not actually understand that what you're agreeing to is much longer than the 2-page contract that you just signed because it's all in the law and everybody knows that's the case. You, as the person coming in, may not be aware of the differences between cancellation provisions or late fee adjustments, or maybe national holidays are a thing even for private employers, right? So making sure that you review kind of those ideas with someone and be like, and ask your vendors, what happens if, what happens if, what happens if, and creating a list of those questions beforehand. By the way, this is something we recommend you do with your attorney too, when you have your client contract or your attendee contract. Making sure that you as the business owner understand how the situation is going to go. Now, many of the locations that retreats are commonly being held now will have a pretty booming tourism industry where there's plenty of people who speak English, so that may not be an issue for you. Contracts, however, especially if you're working with smaller, more local, farm-to-table, small businesses, they may not have contracts and documentation in English that perfectly grammatically correct or completely understandable to you. They may even have contracts in their own language because they're in their own country and doing business in their own country. How crazy is that? Making sure that you're asking for translated contracts when you get them, or understanding the local implications that things may have on a contract is always going to be a good start. By the way, say hi to Daisy. This is Daisy. She's having a nap while we chat about this. And as we've seen in the past couple years, a couple times, you need to make sure that when you're dealing with vendors, there's a distinct possibility that all of a sudden you or one of your attendees may not be able to enter that country, or maybe your vendor's coming from out of country too. And making sure that you address the reality that visa situations can change quickly in a global climate with pandemics and orange men in office who suddenly decide that things aren't how they like them anymore. It's important to know that having flexibility built in for making sure that your vendors can arrive, making sure that your attendees can arrive, or making sure that you're putting all of that responsibility on them and specifically saying you're not responsible if the visa situation changes and people can no longer enter. I'm a fan of saying always, the contract's the bad guy, which allows you to provide good customer service. So if somebody suddenly can't get into Costa Rica for whatever reason, right? Besides them just being silly and their passport was expired, right? We've got a visa situation here. The contract saying that like, sorry, you've paid in full and you figured this out day of, we literally don't have time to fill the spot. It's not really going to be an option for us. Something to consider for both your attendee contract and any vendor contracts that you're presented with are making sure that you have something called a force majeure clause. Essentially, this means like there is a force greater than God. It's originally from the French that made something happen that was, unforeseeable. Nobody could have imagined it happening. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of this. Suddenly, people couldn't access certain products because they couldn't be shipped in time. People couldn't move countries. People couldn't gather more than X amount of people together on a social gathering. So suddenly, the point of these contracts, events or offering certain services in certain places no longer made sense. Making sure that every contract that you sign or offer has a version of this in there will make sure that you're protected from events like that happening, or orange men deciding they don't want to offer visas to somebody anymore. The reality is, when we're hosting international retreats, you may have international participants, or simply you have people that are going to a country that maybe they need a visa for, maybe they need an e-waiver on a visa. And those policies, especially in this political climate, can change quite suddenly and quite radically. So making sure that you've got protection in yours of what happens, how much do we have to refund if something like this happens, right? How foreseeable was it? And, that you've got an out for anything that you can't predict, at least to a point where it makes it fair for the other person. I like to say that contracts are the bad guys, because that allows you to provide great customer service. So even if your contract's really harsh, really strict of we absolutely offer absolutely no refunds whatsoever, being able to sit in the position of like, look, the contract says this, and I understand this crazy thing happened, but what I'd like to offer you is X. And that gives you the flexibility as the retreat host to determine what's going to suit your situation, rather than being controlled by a demanding, likely highly emotional and upset attendee or vendor. These situations are complicated enough, so sometimes having a bad guy that's not actually a person is really helpful. Next up, what happens if somebody gets hurt on your retreat? This is where we really need to talk about things like liability waivers and insurance requirements. And these are things that you can either make as part of your contract or part of your communications. I always recommend both. When we're talking about liability waivers, essentially, what we're saying is that you accept that going on this trip is risky. And how risky it is kind of depends on what trip you're hosting, what activities you're doing during your retreat, the location you're going to, as well as, the attendees that you're trying to draw there. So being very aware of that and making sure that you have a liability waiver that essentially says, like, if you get hurt on our trip in a way that's not us intentionally doing something to you, we have to make sure that you're not going to get sued over that. Because look, the US is sue happy. And we also want to make sure that when you're in those liability waivers or your attendee contract, that you have a governing law clause and a venue selection clause. Why? Because if somebody gets hurt in Spain on your next retreat, the reality is Spain might say, hey, this person was hurt here. And if they're an EU resident, right? Even more so, Spain's going to say, you were hurt here doing an event here and you're one of our residents. We think EU law, Spanish law should apply to this situation if that attendee wants to sue the retreat holding company, right? And by the way, please don't do this personally. Please do it as a company. Create that separation in your business with either an LLC or a corporation and talk to a lawyer, or ideally a lawyer, but at minimum your accountant, about what kind of entity is going to make more sense for you. But rewind. And then what happens? Then you get drug into a Spanish court. Whereas if we have governing law clauses and exclusive venue clauses, you can make sure that anything that happens on your retreat is dealt with back home, which is going to be much easier for you in the end, right? And might discourage people from making some kind of like silly lawsuits that maybe you just don't want to deal with. So we've talked about, making sure that you're getting that liability waiver and making sure that we're putting it in a location where it's going to be easier for you to deal with it in case there is anything. That being said, when it comes to insurance, there's a couple layers of insurance we need to talk about. There is your business insurance, right? Potentially your liability insurance, depending on what industry you're in. We also need to talk about health insurance and medical evacuation insurance. Now, this all goes back to, again, how risky is your retreat? What kind of location are you going to? What kind of activities are you doing and providing and hosting on that? And what are the type of attendees that are coming? All of these things could raise or lower your risk level. When we're talking about your business insurance, we just want to make sure if anyone has a chance to sue your business, that maybe you've got some backup on that. That in case they do, insurance company would be willing to cover a lawyer for you up to a certain amount, and any damage award up to a certain amount. If you're in any kind of regulated profession and you're doing that regulated profession over on the retreat, making sure that any advice or service that you're providing while you're doing that is also going to be covered, even if it's outside of the US. Some insurance policies will have restrictions on, well, the service has to be provided in this way and all of this, or maybe you just have to let them know that you're leaving the US. Right? You give them a certain amount of notice and tell them kind of what's going on. And then we talk about health insurance. A big thing that a lot of people don't think about that's not necessarily on their normal medical insurance, if they're lucky enough to have it in the US, is medical evacuation. Depending on where you are, maybe the hospital system isn't as good. I have a hard time saying that. It's probably better wherever you are than the US. Anyway, but maybe your person, one of your attendees, or even you, right? You get hurt on the trip and it becomes very evident that you would be much more comfortable back in an American healthcare system, maybe just for language issues, right? Making sure that any medical insurance that your attendees have, or at minimum looking for what more commonly has it, is travel health insurance, having a medical evacuation policy. This will remove somebody from the location and send them back to a US service without having to potentially like rearrange their flight. It's really helpful in emergency situations. If you're on small islands, right, and flights are only once a day, there's only one hospital on the island, they're gonna have to fly somewhere to go there. So making sure that you're advising your attendees to get that, confirming they have it, and making sure that in the liability waiver, you tell them, we don't cover this, it's your responsibility to get, is always going to be a good thing. And you know what? Actually, let's talk about that for a second. Let's head over to Pirenópolis in Goiás, Brazil. For example, if you have your retreat policies laid out, when you take your international retreat to go visit one of the oldest churches in Brazil, the oldest church in Goiás, what is this called? The Mother Church of Our Lady of the Rosary, and your retreat attendees are following around the tour guide that you've hired to show them through this beautiful village, town, city? Definitely not city. And your attendees are having such a good time and they've just left the restaurant. They've had a few caipirinhas, which is like the national drink of Brazil. And they're not paying a lot of attention to the fact that the sidewalks are uneven or that the steps are not the same height. And after a little cachaça, suddenly the steps not being the same height causes them to fall. Hopefully, it's an easy fall. Hopefully, it's not a big deal. They can brush it off and, move on. But if it's not, and God forbid they have to go to the hospital or something, if you don't have that local contact point, if you haven't made it clear before they ever came on your retreat, if they're going to need international health insurance, if you haven't purchased it for them, if you don't have a translator or know where the local hospital is if they need to get to it, these things can all ruin an entire day of your 5-day retreat. It's 20%, and it takes up so much time and energy that you didn't need to focus on, that in the end, it's a lot better to think about these things beforehand. This is just one example of one of the policies that we recommend putting in your retreat binder, because it's gonna make your ability to host no such thing as seamless, but host a smooth retreat that when those hiccups pop up, you know exactly how to deal with it. So make sure this is in your retreat binder and we'll move on to the next one. Thanks for watching. If this helped, please tap all the buttons, like, subscribe, and share with your business besties. We're here to make sure that your business gets the protection it deserves.